Karen's eyes blazed with fury as she snatched the keys from Jim's hand. "You'll pay for this," she screeched, storming out the door. Moments later, a crash echoed from the roof. Jim raced outside to find his keys vanished, and a PWC parked right where Karen had thrown them. Jim stared in disbelief as the police officer examined the roof, shaking his head. "Ma'am, those keys are now evidence. You'll need to come with me." Karen's face drained of color. "But I didn't know. It was an accident." The officer gave her a stern look. "You just confessed to intentionally throwing private property onto police grounds. That's a felony." Jim watched, stunned, as the officer cuffed a hysterical Karen and led her to the squad car. His heart pounded. This was spiraling out of control. Karen, his next-door neighbor, had a long history of antagonizing the community. But this time, she'd gone too far. As the car pulled away, a crowd of onlookers had gathered, murmuring in shock. Jim's stomach twisted. The last thing he needed was more neighborhood drama. He hurried back inside, trying to process what had just happened. A short while later, there was a knock at the door. Jim opened it to find Mrs. Lipinski, the HOA president, glaring at him. "I heard what happened," she said icily. "Is it true you're the one who got Karen arrested?" Jim felt a familiar sense of dread. The HOA had long sided with Karen, despite her constant rule-breaking and bullying. "I didn't do anything," he protested. "She threw my keys on the police car." Mrs. Lipinski's eyes narrowed. "Well, the HOA board will be having an emergency meeting about this. You'd better show up and explain yourself." Before Jim could respond, she turned and stormed off. He groaned, closing the door. This was only the beginning. The next evening, Jim sat uncomfortably in the HOA meeting, facing a row of stern-faced board members. Mrs. Lipinski cleared her throat. "Now, Mr. Stevenson, we've heard your neighbor's side of the story, but we'd like to hear from you. What exactly happened?" Jim took a deep breath, trying to keep his voice steady. "It was an accident. Karen got mad at me, and she threw my keys up on the roof of the police car parked on our street. I had nothing to do with her getting arrested." Mrs. Lipinski frowned. "But you're the one who called the police, aren't you?" "No, I didn't call them. Karen's the one who did that." Jim could feel the room turning against him. One of the other board members spoke up. "The police report states that Karen was charged with destruction of government property. That's a serious offense." "I know, but Mrs. Lipinski held up a hand. "Be that as it may, the HOA has a responsibility to maintain order and community harmony. We simply can't have residents causing this kind of disruption." Jim's heart sank. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that until this matter is resolved, we're placing you on probation. No more violations, or you'll be fined. And you're to have no further contact with Karen." Jim stared at her in disbelief. "But she's the one hoe." "This meeting is adjourned." Mrs. Lipinski gave him a stern look. "I'd suggest you go home and think about how to be a better neighbor." As the other board members filed out, Jim sat there, stunned. How had this spiraled so far out of control? And now the HOA was punishing him for Karen's actions. He had a sinking feeling this was only the beginning. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Jim received a summons to appear in court regarding Karen's charges, and he spent hours poring over legal documents, trying to prepare his defense. Meanwhile, the tension in the neighborhood was palpable. Neighbors who had once been friendly now eyed him with suspicion. Jim caught snippets of whispered conversations as he walked down the street, and he could feel the weight of their judgmental stares. And then, the unthinkable happened. Jim arrived home one evening to find his front door ajar, and as he stepped inside, his heart sank. His home had been vandalized, furniture overturned, windows smashed, and the words "rat" scrawled on the walls in bright red paint. Shaking with rage and fear, Jim called the police, who promised to investigate. But deep down, he knew exactly who was responsible. The next day, Jim confronted Karen, who was just emerging from her house. "I know it was you," he shouted, his voice shaking. "You broke into my home and trashed the place." Karen's eyes widened, and for a moment, Jim thought he saw a flash of guilt. But then her expression hardened, and she crossed her arms defiantly. "I don't know what you're talking about," she snapped. "Maybe you should keep your nose out of other people's business, hmm?" Jim clenched his fists, struggling to control his temper. "This isn't just about me anymore, Karen. You've gone too far. I'm going to make sure you pay for what you've done." Karen's lips curled into a sneer. "Good luck with that, Mr. Stevenson. You're just a nobody in this neighborhood. Nobody's going to believe you over me." With that, she turned and stalked back into her house, leaving Jim seething with rage and uncertainty. He knew he had to do something, but he also knew that the odds were stacked against him. This was a battle he couldn't afford to lose. The morning of the court hearing dawned gray and overcast, perfectly reflecting Jim's mood as he made his way to the courthouse. As he approached the entrance, he spotted Karen, standing with her lawyer and looking smug. Jim took a deep breath and steeled himself for the confrontation ahead. He knew he had a strong case. The police have found evidence linking Karen to the vandalism, and the keys on the police car were clearly an accident. But he also knew that the HOA was firmly on Karen's side, and that could make all the difference. As the hearing began, Jim presented his evidence and testimony, carefully recounting the events that had led to this point. He could feel the judge's gaze weighing heavily on him, and he couldn't help but glance nervously at the HOA members seated in the gallery. Karen's lawyer, on the other hand, was relentless. He painted Jim as a troublemaker, someone who had deliberately antagonized his neighbor and brought this whole mess upon himself. He even implied that the vandalism could have been the work of a third party, someone with a grudge against Jim. Jim felt his heart sinking as the judge listened intently, his expression unreadable. This was a battle he couldn't afford to lose, but the odds were stacked against him. Finally, the judge cleared his throat and delivered his verdict. "Based on the evidence presented, I find the defendant, Karen Johnson, guilty of destruction of property and disorderly conduct." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom, and Jim felt a surge of relief. But the judge wasn't finished. "However, I also find the plaintiff, Mr. Stevenson, partially responsible for the escalation of this conflict. Both parties will be required to attend community mediation and pay restitution for the damages caused." Jim stared at the judge in disbelief, his heart sinking. He had won the battle, but the war was far from over. As he left the courthouse, he knew he had to find a way to break the cycle of conflict with Karen once and for all. In the weeks that followed the court hearing, Jim and Karen were ordered to attend a series of community mediation sessions. The sessions were tense and uncomfortable, with both parties stubbornly refusing to back down. Karen continued to maintain her innocence, despite the overwhelming evidence against her. She insisted that Jim was the one who had escalated the conflict, and that she was the true victim in all of this. Jim, meanwhile, grew increasingly frustrated with Karen's refusal to take responsibility for her actions. He had hoped that the court ruling would be a wake-up call, but it seemed that Karen was more determined than ever to make his life a living hell. As the mediation sessions dragged on, tensions in the neighborhood reached a boiling point. Neighbors who had once been friendly to both Jim and Karen now found themselves taking sides, with some siding with Jim and others standing firmly behind Karen. The HOA, in particular, remained firmly in Karen's corner. Mrs. Lipinski continued to pressure Jim to back down, warning him that further violations could result in heavy fines or even expulsion from the neighborhood. Jim, however, refused to be cowed. He knew that he was in the right, and he was determined to see this through to the end. He began reaching out to other neighbors, trying to rally support and expose Karen's true nature. But Karen was not about to go down without a fight. She launched a campaign of harassment, targeting Jim's property and even his family. Jim's car was vandalized, his lawn was covered in trash, and his children were subjected to taunts and bullying at school. Jim felt like he was living in a nightmare, and he knew that something had to give. He couldn't keep living like this, constantly looking over his shoulder and worrying about what Karen might do next. As the mediation sessions came to a close, Jim knew that he had to take matters into his own hands. He had to find a way to put an end to this once and for all, even if it meant going to war with the entire neighborhood. With the mediation sessions at a standstill and the HOA firmly on Karen's side, Jim knew he had to get creative if he wanted to put an end to the conflict. He began doing his own research, digging into Karen's past and uncovering a pattern of troublemaking that stretched back years. As Jim dug deeper, he discovered that Karen had a history of filing frivolous lawsuits and making false claims against her neighbors. He also found evidence that she had been able to manipulate the HOA in the past, using her influence and connections to get her way. Armed with this information, Jim decided to take his case directly to the media. He reached out to a local news station, pitching them a story about the Karen who was terrorizing her neighborhood and the local government's failure to hold her accountable. The news segment was a bombshell, exposing Karen's history of misconduct and the HOA's complicity in enabling her behavior. Suddenly, the eyes of the entire community were focused on Jim and Karen's conflict, and it was clear that the tide was turning. Karen, meanwhile, was furious. She tried to fight back, using her connections to pressure the news station and even threaten legal action. But Jim refused to back down, and he continued to press his case, using social media and community forums to rally support. As the story gained traction, other neighbors began to come forward, sharing their own stories of harassment and abuse at the hands of Karen. The HOA, realizing that they were now on the wrong side of public opinion, began to back away from their support of Karen, fearing the consequences of their actions. Finally, Karen's reign of terror came to an end when the city's mayor, who had been following the story closely, stepped in and initiated an investigation into the HOA's handling of the situation. The HOA's leadership was forced to resign, and Karen was hit with a series of fines and legal sanctions that effectively put an end to her ability to terrorize the neighborhood. As the dust settled, Jim stood victorious, having proven that even the most powerful Karen can be brought down by the power of community and the truth. In the aftermath of the media firestorm and the HOA shakeup, Jim found himself the reluctant hero of the neighborhood. Neighbors who had once been wary of him now sought him out, offering apologies and expressions of gratitude for his courage in standing up to Karen. But Jim's victory came at a price. The stress and anxiety of the past few months had taken a toll on his health and his relationships. His wife, Sarah, had been supportive throughout the ordeal, but the constant barrage of drama and conflict had put a strain on their marriage. As Jim tried to rebuild his life and regain a sense of normalcy, he found himself grappling with a new challenge: how to heal the wounds that had been inflicted on the community. The HOA, in the wake of its leadership shakeup, was struggling to regain the trust of the residents. Many were still resentful of the way the organization had sided with Karen, and they were skeptical of the new board's ability to right the ship. Jim knew that he would need to play a pivotal role in this process if the neighborhood was to truly move forward. He began attending HOA meetings, offering his input and expertise, and helping to establish new policies and procedures that would ensure greater transparency and accountability. At the same time, Jim reached out to his former adversary, Karen, in a surprising move. He invited her to a private meeting where he proposed a path forward, one that would involve her making amends to the community and working to repair the damage she had caused. To Jim's surprise, Karen was receptive to the idea. She had been humbled by the public backlash and the legal consequences of her actions, and she was eager to find a way to make things right. Together, Jim and Karen worked to organize a neighborhood-wide event, where they would publicly apologize and provide restitution for the damages they had caused. It was a powerful moment of healing and reconciliation, and it marked the beginning of a new era for the community. As Jim walked away from the event, he felt a sense of relief and optimism. The battle had been hard fought, but in the end, justice and community had prevailed. Now, the real work of rebuilding and restoring trust could begin. In the months that followed, the neighborhood underwent a remarkable transformation. With Karen's cooperation and the new, more transparent HOA leadership, the community began to heal and come together in ways it hadn't in years. Karen, true to her word, took responsibility for her actions and worked tirelessly to make amends. She participated in community service projects, volunteered at local schools, and even organized neighborhood events that brought people together. Jim, for his part, played a pivotal role in this process, serving on the HOA board and using his influence to promote a spirit of reconciliation and unity. He worked closely with Karen, offering guidance and support as she navigated the road to redemption. As the community's wounds began to heal, Jim and Sarah's own relationship also started to mend. The stress and strain of the conflict had taken a toll, but they both recognized the importance of rebuilding and moving forward. One day, while out for a walk, Jim encountered Mrs. Lipinski, the former HOA president who had so staunchly supported Karen. To his surprise, she approached him with a contrite expression. "Jim, I owe you an apology," she said, her voice trembling. "I was blinded by my own biases and prejudices, and I let my personal feelings cloud my judgment. I should have listened to you, and I'm sorry for the pain and suffering I caused." Jim was taken aback by her words, but he could see the sincerity in her eyes. "Thank you, Mrs. Lipinski. I appreciate your honesty. I know it couldn't have been easy." Mrs. Lipinski nodded. "I hope you can forgive me, and that we can work together to make this community the kind of place we all want to live in." Jim smiled, reaching out to shake her hand. "I think that's a great idea. Let's get started." As they walked together, Jim couldn't help but feel a sense of pride and accomplishment. The battle had been long and difficult, but in the end, it had brought the community closer together. And for Jim, that was the greatest victory of all.